Welcome to the second day of the workshop launching the Brazilian Network of Citizen Science. Before starting today's works, we would like to once again acknowledge the Institute of Advanced Studies and the Dean for Advanced Studies at University of São Paulo. Today we have Natalia Kawabi, Luciana França, and Sheila Coffey. We thank their participation. They are members of the steering committee, and they will comment, they will register all the questions you pose in the chat, both in YouTube and here at Zoom. We also would like to manifest our solidarity to all families that lost more than 300,000 people who lost their lives to COVID-19. We also would like to seize this opportunity to appeal to all participants in this event to collaborate with vulnerable populations in this country. Donations, even small, are very important for those who are needing. Those in need cannot wait, and actions must be immediate. So we appeal for your engagement in these campaigns because Brazil needs help. We live mixed feelings of sadness for everything that is happening to our country, but very happy for this event that is the materialization of a dream and an act of resistance. So, resuming our activities, our roundtable has a focus of interdisciplinary action in Brazilian institutions that are necessary to make feasible the interaction between our peers and society. With this roundtable, we want to offer elements for a discussion about the barriers that hinder the emergency or continuity of science in society, with example of citizen science that is an open science, and also give grounds to discuss this based on the experiences brought by our guests. We remember that at the end of the presentations, we will have a brief break, and right after we will open the floor for a debate with our panelists, with the participants of the event. We also would like to remind you that the contributions of speakers and participants during the debate will subsidize a letter of intentions that will be shared to all the stakeholders, including policymakers and decision makers, with information to advance citizen science in our country. We also would like to remind you all that in case of Zoom, there is an icon for questions and answers, Q&A icon in the lower bar tool, but don't put them in the comment in the chat. Leave the chat for just comments, but questions, please place them in for the icon for questions and answers. So now I will present our speakers. Our first speaker of the day is Professor Maria Carmen Lemos. She has a bachelor degree in the University of Juiz de Fora and a PhD, master's and PhD by the MIT. And she's a professor in the University of Michigan, and her interests are adaptation to climate and the role of knowledge in adaptive capacity and use of technical scientific knowledge to build these policies. Maria Carmen was one of the main authors of one of the evaluations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes, and the fourth climate evaluation in US. Then we have Pedro Luis Bernardo da Rocha. He's a biologist, master and doctor from the University of São Paulo, currently a tenure professor in the University of Bahia with experience in ecology, emphasis in ecology of ecosystems, and currently investigates themes related to ecology and public policies and policy making. He's a member of the Institute of Science and Technology and Interdisciplinary studies in ecology and in INTRI, where he coordinates a project in science and internet. And then we will have Dr. Marisa Mamed, also a biologist by the University de Niterói. She's master in environment development by the from the University of Ceará, and a doctor in ecology from the University of Brasilia. Currently analyst in science and technology in CNPq, where she manages the Center for Synthesis and Biodiversity and Ecosystems, CBOs. And finally, we have the pleasure of receiving in this roundtable Professor Yuri Castelfranchi. He's a physicist by the University Telestudi La Sapienza in Rome, Italy, and with a master's in communication of science from the International School for in Trieste, and doctor in sociology by the University of Campinas. It's a very interdisciplinary profile, currently associate professor on the Federal University of Minas Gerais, coordinating the interdisciplinary laboratory of INCITY, in innovation in citizenship and technology in science, member of the managing committee of the National Institute of Science and Technology for Public Communication and Science and Technology, INCITY, and coordinates AMREC, which is a course, a specialization course, interdisciplinary in public communication of science. And I would like to remind all that are interested that we have subscriptions opened up to the 30th of March, and for the course, and we are doing this advertising because this is a junior course. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Lemos. Thank you, Blandi. Good morning, everyone. I thank very much the invitation, and it's a pleasure to talk in such an interdisciplinary event that tries to understand and act in this space on how science can help people to improve their situation and also the country to have a better use of science. I thank the invitation. But before starting, I would like to excuse myself for two reasons. First, it's been many years that I live in US, and sometimes I have a truncated words, and so I ask for help. Maybe this will happen during this talk. And the other thing, my slides I try to translate into Portuguese, but the graphic accents are missing. So those who treasure grammar, I excuse myself. So let me share my slides.
Pronto. Tá visível o slide?
Can you see them?
Perfeito, professor.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. So, starting, I work in this area of the use of knowledge for many years. I came to this field almost for accident. My research started in Brazil. My doctorate started in Brazil, trying to understand the problems related to the anti-pollution movement in the city of Cubatão, state of São Paulo. In this context, I researched and with ranks in CETESB, and also people in the social movement in Cubatão, people that were suffering from pollution. And this was an extremely engaging process, engaged in science, because science was a factor both in negotiations and also in the remediation policies. So from that moment, I started to think on the role of science in decision-making process. Traditionally, science is separated from the politic res, the res publica. First, because from the idea that science has to be free from any political pressure, using knowledge to subsidize knowledge. So science speaks through to power. The other factor is that universities, even the public universities, were created with this idea of separation, and separation from politics and separation from other scientific disciplines. So what happened within time is that we had to develop a science to understand science. And what is that? Empirically, we started to find that neither is science dispolitized, neither is it split apart from society, neither they comply with their social contract with society. So if society subsidizes science, science has to pay back to society and think how to face and help the problems the society faces. With this backdrop, a lot of people is researching this intersection between science and society. This is a science that is growing fastly and globally. Within science, there's people studying science itself, interaction of science with society, and the knowledge itself. Myself, I do a little bit of each, and I would like to hear from you some examples of empirical and theoretical work. One example is trying to understand why is there so much science that does not engage with the users, with the stakeholders, people that should use science to make decisions and make better decisions than what they are making without science. Well, this is a theoretical model that I published some years ago with some students of mine, Christine Kirchhoff and Vijay Rampasarad. And what I was trying to understand is that much of what we tried to do with this model was exactly differentiating who does science and what does people do with science, because the flow is from who produce to those who use. And the models of intersection were traditionally from science and not from user, from stakeholder, from science user. So I have an idea. I believe this idea will help the society. I carry out research. I publish my paper. And I hope that the society that inspired me to do my research will read my papers, or at least look at my webpage in the internet and understand how this knowledge was generated. And those producing science believe that knowledge is useful, especially applied science, not that much pure science. There is this idea that you are trying to help, that you're trying to solve a problem with applied science. What you discover, from the other hand, with the stakeholders that are not using science, that this science is inexistent. It is produced, informed, or communicated by means that user usually do not follow or do not pay attention to, because they already have knowledge coming from other sources that they consider adequate, proper for decision making. So science is useful, but it's not used. So making this distinction. And in order for it to be useful and used, our hypothesis is that we need the interaction of both sides, the production and the user, the producer and the user. And in this interaction, there is a lot of empirical and theoretical research to see how knowledge goes from useful to usable to used. For instance, there are all these factors in this realm: interaction, interaction, collaboration, knowledge that is produced, that is commissioned, and there is a whole framework of factors that we have a lot of research about, trying to understand this relationship. But actually what happens is that this relationship is intermediated by different factors that are not proper to this, the design, this strategic design between producing and using. For instance, most parts of research question these terms, producing and using, this dichotomy between this flow, this pathway between science and society. There's a lot of research about politicization of this pathway. There's a lot of research about legitimacy, fairness, and power of this pathway. And there's a lot of research, the applied research, that tries to understand how to improve this pathway. And I'm in this category. One of the things I do in the United States, I manage a center that is financed by NOAA. It exists for 10 years already and probably will exist for another 5. That is called GLISA, Great Lakes Assessment, that tries to increase the use of climate information that is produced in university by the users in the region of Great Lakes where the university is located. So one of the examples of works of GLISA is to be a boundary organization creating a bridge between university and society. This pictures and one example. There is climate information that are produced, models that are uncertain, they're low level of precision. So how do you work in this border, in this boundary, to increase the usability of this knowledge? We work with a group of cities, 30 cities in the region, and the sustainability managers in the cities, they work with us to trying to improve the usability of climate information. And they use climate information. We call this model a chain, a boundary organization chain, starting in the university. GLISA is in the middle, the group of cities in the Great Lake region that we call Great Lakes Climate Action Network, the cities themselves that are the users using this type of information to plan the adaptation, to plan sustainability, to try to convince cities to be more proactive in terms of adaptation to climate. Another type of research, this is a 5-year project financed by the American government, the Department of Agriculture, and the USDA, and we tried to produce with maize corn farmer in the corn belt where we have most of United States agriculture to ponder the effects of climate change, especially rainfall and temperature, and how this affects agriculture. So we created 5 tools for decision making: when to plant, how to plant, soil quality, with a small group, intense group of farmers in the region. And we are trying to understand how can these tools be spread to be used to all the farmers in the region. So this research here is trying to understand how to scale up this relationship in co-production. Can this relation be amplified if a farmer that didn't take part in the program know that other farmers, as he or she took part? Will this increase the reliability of the farmers in the tool? The values and characteristics and advantages of co-production, of working together to produce tools for decision making, do they transfer to other people?
So you know about the theories of knowledge transfer. When something works, it spreads out. So the hybrid seeds, for example, it spread because one grower saw the other benefiting from these tools, and it exploded. But the problem of climate information is that it does not give you more money, but it's an information that penalizes you. Rather, nobody wants to do things to prepare for climate change because they're costly. So the fact that it's co-produced by a group of trust means that I will be more open to use that tool. So this is one kind of research that we do. So after we followed up closely on this co-production, we had a great marketing campaign in trade fairs, in farmers' meetings, in newsletters in the region to try to amplify the usability of this process. What we saw is that, in fact, it degrades. The more you get far away from the production process, the more difficult it is to try to sell the idea of these tools. So, to me, this new research aims at increasing the value of co-production. Co-production is defined as this relationship between the scientist and the potential user of the knowledge. And when you increase both the impact of this co-production, of this interaction, and also how you understand what the problems are in this relationship: power problems, equity problems, justice problems. It's very costly to keep this relationship in the long term in these groups of intense exchange. Problems of institutional support, because universities do not give you support for this kind of work. From the point of view of the scientist, it does not give reputation or fame, only costs. A problem of time for the stakeholders that have complex lives, full lives. They don't need any more work. So when you increase, on the other hand, we have good evidence that co-production increases the quality of research and also the usability of the knowledge. So it's a relationship of co-benefit, both for science and the users, the potential users. So here we have 3 examples of research projects that I'm part of. The first was a social experiment, trying to understand what were the differences if you interact with the user face-to-face, using webinars, or a tutorial in the internet without anyone. Well, I thought an experiment with almost 300 people, we thought that the difference was reduced between the webinar and the face-to-face. This was conducted 4 years ago. Ironically, we are all now using webinars to communicate because of the pandemic. So it was an idea, as Kingdom would say, an idea whose time has come. So we had not planned for it. We simply were trying to understand how to amplify that. The other example is to run like smaller experiments in the 3 levels of interaction. So we ran the same experiment in 3 cities with the same tool. We increased to 12 cities. We conducted a deep qualitative study of the barriers and advantages of using the tool, and now we are applying it to another project. We won a bidding process, and now we have this process with 60 cities in the region of the American Gulf with a much more developed tool. So we are in the middle of the recruiting session for the cities. We are already working with 40 cities, but this project was deeply affected by the pandemic, especially in terms of the adherence of the cities that, as anywhere else in the world, are totally involved. Our hope that until the end of the year, we have a reasonable number, and this project wishes to understand how these tools influence the perception of decision makers about their own adaptive capacity. This is a project focused on the management of stormwater management. This is increasing a lot because we have more rainfall in the city, especially in the Gulf region, with hurricanes, storms and floods. So now I'm going to pivot to a different direction, trying to understand if in the research, how we could think of the Brazilian model of interaction. Brazil has many points in common with several other countries and also differences from other countries. If, as Blanche was saying, if you ask me what are the barriers for interaction with society, I could say that in a smaller scale, I live in the US, many of the things that people will describe as barriers in Brazil: lack of a professional team, lack of funding, culture of society hierarchy, and also university hierarchy, in which the theoretical work has more reputation than the practical work. All of these adversities we have in the US as well. Of course, in a smaller scale, we have more resources for science in general, but these barriers do not disappear, even if we have more resources. This is all connected to values, to attitude, and to culture of the university and of knowledge in general. But what is it different in the Brazilian model? It's different from the European model, but closer to the American model, in the sense that what are the types of interaction that we find. So we can think of the art of engagement. What is the art of engagement? It can engage the society in different ways. It can engage through consulting work, through co-production, in types of research involving society, and citizen science is a wonderful example. You can co-produce, which is most of my work. What is the definition of co-production? Is a significant interaction between researchers and potential users of knowledge, and how this interaction will increase the usability of the knowledge in 2 ways. In 2 lines. One, the user informs the researcher what they need, what's interesting for them, and the researcher is open to change what they're doing to supply for those needs, to provide for the needs. And there is research in this area. You have 3 types of niches of co-production. One is in public administration that pioneered Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom pioneered that in the 1970s and 1980s. And it says that in the public administration, when you have a complementary characteristic between the private and the public sector, you can get more effective public policies. In the STS science, technology and society, which is a science that is a mix of philosophy political sciences and anthropology, this tradition is more descriptive and constructivist. You co-produce because you exist. There is no co-production. And scientists live as a social beings in this society. Scientists co-produce knowledge because they cannot divorce from that. Nobody can separate one thing from the other. In a more normative approach, which is the one that I follow, sees that as a goal, an objective of science, which is this interaction exactly. So I'm going to go through the slides, at least to tell you a little bit more about this approach. It's a new idea. I would like to hear from you about your feedback. The first time that I gave a talk in Brazil, 10 years ago in São Paulo, when I talk about this work of co-production, a very famous social scientist from the University of São Paulo got really annoyed with my speech and told me universities observe and criticize. And I think she meant the university will not interfere in the things of society. That made me think. I was not offended. I am just like Lulu Santos, a Brazilian singer, saying we think all types of knowledge are fair. But I began to think more and more about this division. When I started working in Brazil, I studied in CETES. I studied the management of water in the Northeast in Brazil with CETESB in a very decentralized way. And I studied exactly this area of technocratic insulation. How in Brazil, the agencies form their own knowledge totally divorced from society. But at the same time, both examples that I studied, Cubatão in São Paulo and the Northeast, they form networks that were really positive for the outcome of the projects. And these networks were formed because the knowledge and each element of the network added more power to the network to face the common enemy. In the case of Cubatão against the companies, and in the Northeast, the resistance against decentralizing the decision-making. So these networks, they were unequal in terms of power, but they have a potential for great impact. When I was in Bahia 2 years ago, one thing that caught my attention in how the master's degree in biology from the Federal University of Bahia would put me directly in contact with several agencies. So I think we complain about the technocratic model, but when the ones that are making decisions in these agencies are people that were educated in this university. So why not look at this advantage of this technocratic model? If these people, if these scientists are still engaged with universities, so why not cultivate this relationship? So I always tell my students, what do you think of technocratic models? Everybody complains, they think it's negative, but at the same time, they're the ones who will work in this technocratic environments. So what make a technocracy bad in the wholesale, but potentially positive in the retail? Because these people, they have their hearts in the right place. They work for the good. They want to change, but it's a complex structure. So encouraging these relationships with people out of the university can strengthen these people to resist. An example, for example, in the 4 years that we lived under Trump administration, he simply cut all resources for science and university and science within universities. What really saved us were these people that tried to do this work of holding back to what could be kept in the face of this attack from the federal administration. I'm going to show you, this is a model in the Northeast where we see a contradiction between technocratic insulation and democracy. But as time goes by, these groups were formed and they starting to going against the technicians, and they gain more power in the relationships. I want to show you this because I'm interested to know what you think. You have these contradictions between the use, the impact, and those who participate, who can participate. And when they participate, how do they participate? In what position of power? How do they value knowledge? So you have trade-offs in this types of relationships. And you see that I put science, citizen science here with an interrogation mark, because citizen science can scale up the use of science because thousands of people may participate, but it can be very detrimental as well. Can be only citizen science informing science, but not benefiting from science. So how is this relationship? How is this relationship between the maximum impact power and this relationship of this democracy, of these partnerships? Okay. I hope I have not exceeded my time, but I'm super interested in knowing what you think again when we have our debate session. Thank you, Maria. It was excellent. I think we have a lot to debate after our breaks, especially what you say about this new form of research that we need. And we need to try to find this balance and trying to increase the usability and the social impact of the research that we do, and at the same time overcoming this barrier related to the lack of institutional resources, human resources, and the value given to researchers. These are the challenges that we have ahead of us. Pedro has already uploaded his presentation, so I pass the floor to him. Pedro, you have the floor. Good morning, everyone. Karen, Marisa, Yuri, Blondie, and all the others who are here with us. First of all, I want to tell you that it's an honor to participate of this panel. I think it's one of the most important initiatives that are happening in Brazil, and I hope that we are positively, that we find we are met with a positive welcome from society. So for me, it's important to be here, to hear from our colleagues, and I want to tell you about my ideas and experiences on the theme. So first of all, I want to talk about who I am, why am I here talking about this topic, and I have a story that is different from Carmen's. From the beginning of her academic work, she started already analyzing the relationship between science and society. I come from being a researcher in the area of ecology. Along my career, I started to feel the need to identify how the produced knowledge could impact society, and I realized very quickly how difficult it was. By interacting with other colleagues, I started then embracing the reasons why it was so difficult to identify these reasons, and hearing from environmental managers telling us that the problem was not science. Science would not solve environmental problems, and somehow it generated questions for me and a lot of interest to understand better the relationship between science and its application. And so it led me to put ecology a little bit aside and to embrace more these topics. And this maybe, I think my profile can be a little representative of people that want to approximate science and practice, because some of these people that work in this area, sometimes they don't have the experience in transdisciplinary approaches and working institutions that value this kind of approximation. Exactly. So in my talk, I will explore exactly this experience that I have, my background, to try to debate exactly the topic of our panel. So I will try to contrast this vision of universities that have to do with the relationship between science and society, and the role of university exploring this dichotomy between rigor and relevance. Talking about the political dispute, and this is my contribution. I think that people involved with this discussion must keep this in mind, to change the balance of forces inside the university and trying to contribute to have a greater impact.
Well, to save time, because I talk too much sometimes, I produce a text and I will try to read it and skip the slides at the same time. So I'll try to present a general argument about the need of exploring transdisciplinary in our universities and present some suggestions on how to do it based on the experiences we had in the Institute of Biology in the Federal University of Bahia. And therefore, the suggestions are more related to the action of researcher and teacher, professor, how this person in this environment can somehow overcome the limits to have a more transdisciplinary action. Did you skip a slide? Yes. So I will present in my slides to the left these sentences. There are 4 sentences that are part of the argument. My first statement is that universities should increase their social relevance, or shall increase. This statement is present in an article published at the end of the 20th century, representing an understanding that the knowledge produced by transdisciplinary universities is not enough to contribute to this problem solving in the real world. And this stems from the characteristics of the problems, because they are complex. So each observer has access to a limited part of the relevant aspects and is completed with their personal framework and is never capable of accomplishing the whole problem. And on the other dimension, they are ambiguous, and the problem is the difference between the real situation and the real world expectation. And in the real world, that each observer understands depend on their value system. A series of social changes started in the second half of the 20th century contribute to require from the universities of the different countries an accountability about their actions. In the counterculture movement in 1970, both science and university were questioned about their social contributions. The very expansion of higher education that happened right after increased the expenses for universities, putting their performance on society radar. Right after the consolidation of public managerialism and neoliberalism submitted universities to performance standard based on company management, questioning the efficacy of the products of the university for society. And finally, the development and application of the concept entrepreneur university capable to adapt to market demands. And the third mission of the university, mainly related to production of technology for this productive sector, imposed a new pattern in the relationship of many universities and countries with society. Meanwhile, within the same university and science, started a reflection about their modes of interaction with society. In the beginning of the 70s, the idea of a transdisciplinary university was formulated, having as admission the action vis-a-vis the society and their problems. And a moment of interaction between different scientific areas that is was called initially transdisciplinary by Piaget. These ideas were recovered as of the 90s with proposals on the new mode of doing science, which is science mode 2, with transdisciplinary, focusing on society problem solving. And then there was a series of proposals for methodological action in different areas of knowledge on how to make the scientific production more relevant. The second statement in my argument is that the most effective mode for university to increase their effectiveness is the co-production with social sectors. So by the end of the Second World War, a model on how the relationship between science and problem solving was formulated and became hegemonic, not only in the United States, but in other countries. According to this model, society provide resources to scientific community, researchers without being submitted to external pressures, or therefore without political pressure. They define the focus of their research and define collectively the criteria to evaluate their quality and make their results public. And these results may be used by the different sectors of society in the decision-making processes and for the production of technology. However, as Carmen said, after many decades of studies in the relationship between science, university, and society, make the knowledge produced by university inaccessible, non-usable, not used by society. And therefore, bidirectional models were proposed and implemented for the relationship between the science application. They try to cover the problems of accessibility, usability, and legitimacy of knowledge based on the co-production process. This process aimed to generate both rigorous scientific knowledge and as relevant solutions, which is the title of my talk in this dichotomy. So the third statement is that those researchers and professors in university that aim to engage with productions in the social sectors, they find structural and deep difficulties due to the priority focus of university and science to rigor and not relevance. So, I'm sorry, this part stems from this work that is cited in the screen, that authored by me and Blandina, that is here with us in the panel. Usually, this scheme shows the university as a black box, the division in disciplines that are the colored boxes, and the professors within the colored boxes interacting with other professor researchers in the university, and also some interaction with the social sector that I will show in the next slides. Usually, a researcher professor acting in a university of transdisciplinary background had an academic for education that was rigorous but decontextualized. In their background is immersed in academic culture that normalizes the interdisciplinary action and is submitted to academic policies based on the linear model of interaction with science and application that value this type of action, of acting. In the research acting that is one in the boxes, this is reinforced when the questions of their projects are responded by their own discipline of background, and when they establish collaborations of research with her peers with same formation. In extension that is marked in this scheme with this diagram as 2, they reinforce the purpose of the university aligned with the deficit model, or the relationship between university and society is a relationship between those who have knowledge and those who do not have knowledge. So in this unilateral and prevents the knowledge coming from society going into university. I'm sorry, I got lost here. So they align to the deficit model and they base their action with the society with unidirectional transfer of scientific knowledge, which is this unidirectional arrow going from the professor, the researcher to society. In student tutoring, they tutor students only in their own field of knowledge, their own discipline, without connection with sectors of society involved in concrete problems, which is the square 3. In teaching, they reinforce university when they offer discipline only their background for students in the same area using decontextualized methods of teaching, which is number 4. Finally, the 4th statement in my argument. So, for the advancements towards interdisciplinary be consolidated, we need an academic agenda. For a professor to be multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, they should do it despite the policies, the academic policies and culture that are imposed, and to contribute to eliminate these structural limits. It's necessary that the professor, in addition, discuss politically the inclusion of transdisciplinary and social relevance in the academic institutional agenda, trying to decrease the monopoly and give invisibility to the university in function of transdisciplinary and academic rigor. To address this issue, it's important to understand a particular characteristic of the governance in public universities in Brazil. Although, as I said, the new managerialism and neoliberalism from the 20th century had an impact in universities in developed countries, especially in Europe. This did not happen with the Brazilian public universities. They maintain bureaucratic management standard and a collegiate governance. So the internal policymakers in universities and the executors are part of the same group, which are professors and researchers that rotate in decision positions in the collegiate areas and continue to develop their research and education activities. So it is important to take into consideration that is in the area of policy. They will assume governmental policy and they assume that there is a separation between the political system and bureaucratic system of regulation. The decision-making process is bureaucratic. And in Brazilian universities, these two systems are formed by the same people. As such, it's possible to characterize two strategies for agenda dispute, which is the topic of this last argument of expansion of conflict, and apply them to the transdisciplinary case in university in each of the dimensions of actions of professors. And so now I will describe these strategies and the use by our group at UFBA trying to overcome these institutional structures. In the first strategy for the group with less political power, which I assume that is the group that defends the adoption of transdisciplinary in university policies. So for this group to dispute the institutional agenda, they should be capable of sustain the conflict and make clear that there is a debate that is not being made but is important, and expand it, seeking support of other stakeholders that were not paying attention to the conflict. Those can increase the pressure to add this topic to the institutional agenda. So this is a way for a group with less political power to increase their power by bringing those who are not involved with the conflict yet to the dispute. So to break down with the disciplinary orientation in research and extension based on this strategy, the professor or group, they should engage in transdisciplinary projects, answering questions from the real world, developing collaborations with social sectors of society involved in the problem as professors in other areas of knowledge. In order to do so, they have to overcome the difficulties imposed by the academic background, learning through practice. In addition, these projects may provide resources for formation for students and professors by co-production to overcome the technical gaps. Based on these activities, these professors may give visibility to the topic of transdisciplinary and relevance vis-a-vis the academic community, increasing the connection of this community to engage them in the agenda in dispute within the university. In the case of tutoring activities, professors may tutor students in transdisciplinary projects, counting with the participation of co-directors, co-tutors in other areas. They can tutor students, graduate students, defining research lines based on concrete problems that they face. With that, they contribute to change their very previous background that was more disciplinary and contribute to a different education for the students. In teaching, they can open spots for students from other areas and inviting professors from other disciplines and from the applied sector to co-impart classes and take part in activities. And in addition to give to the students some level of transdisciplinary background, they can increase the topic, calling attention to their agenda, giving visibility to the problem. In the second strategy for institutional agenda dispute, in this strategy, the university governance have to generate an item in the institutional agenda, expand it to other stakeholders, trying to facilitate the implementation of the policy, making clear the existence of a conflict. So these are suggestions to act when the professors that's so far were part of a minority of agenda formulation or a group that was not interested in the topic start to have a position of relevance in the university. So to use this strategy in the fields of research and extension, professors can take managing positions in the university and start to support and value the transdisciplinary purpose. This can mobilize a greater part of the university community for this agenda, and the dialogue of this professor is no longer with the small group, but with the university and society as a whole. In the case or in the field of tutoring and teaching, professors may influence the reformulation of pedagogic projects and value the interdisciplinary dialogue and having interdisciplinary activities that will reach and mobilize greater parts of the academic community and start to support this community, to include in the institutional agenda the possibility of facilitating transdisciplinary research that have more relevance. To close, I would like to say that this type of action and dispute of agenda already seemed to be important previously to the political scenario that we are living in Brazil, because the university is losing the status in society and is being questioned. And it is very important for them to survive, that they can prove their capacity and effectiveness and contribution to problem solving in society. And for that, it's necessary to have a greater interaction between university and society. In the current context where we have the current political context where there is a clear opposition to scientific knowledge and public university, this is even more important. And maybe represents a window of opportunity so that these people that are already acting within universities, carrying out co-production activities and eventually participating in the institutional agenda, find windows of opportunity to raise more, to gather more participants and more adhesion to this formulation, so the agenda of relevance be incorporated to the university agendas. So thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't surpass my time, and I will be available for discussions after the presentations.
Thank you, Pedro. You really brought a range of different solutions, and we'll certainly reflect on those solutions exactly to overcome these barriers for this multidisciplinary. We can talk even so. So first of all, I want to invite, to thank you for the invitation. For me, it's a pleasure and an honor to bring a little bit of the experience of the last 3 or 4 years of the structuring, the Synthesis Center of Biodiversity with a CNPq. This is a very promising initiative, very important in the scenario we are living today in Brazil. And also for the approximation of science and society, which is exactly the topic of our discussion today. I'm going to control my time. You don't need to worry. I tried to focus my presentation thinking of the organizational structure, my professional experience with the CNPq. For 10 years, I managed the research program called PELD, and now I am dedicating to this structuring of the synthesis center, the symbiosis, it's the name. So it's a practical experience, more practical than academic, but it's an interesting point to this discussion. So I will address 3 topics: the synthesis center as a transdisciplinary site, the challenges to promote transdisciplinary projects from this for this public foment agents, and also the role of the different stakeholders in all of this process. I'm sorry, my slides are not advancing. I cannot advance my slides.
Você pode usar as setinhas do seu...
You can use the arrows. Yes, they're here. So the next slide, before talking about the structure of the Center of Synthesis, I want to tell you what is a Knowledge Synthesis Center. It's not a concept that is very much known in Brazil, but to talk about this centers of knowledge synthesis, we must understand first what is the scientific synthesis. According to this model that we are trying to adopt and find, a Brazilian model based on the international experience correspond to a research approach that is inter or transdisciplinary, collaborative, and also involve work groups. So these are collaboration networks. There's another way of seeing this organization of this work. This is a model that aims at integrating different disciplines, different perspectives, academic and non-academic disciplines, and their stakeholders, especially in the environmental area, which is what we are talking about here. This is important. When we say transdisciplinarity, we mean that we integrate different types of knowledge in the practice of research. So this model aims at conceptualizing the problem, going beyond the borders of any individual discipline, beyond any data set or database, to go beyond these barriers, to try to reorganize, recontextualize, systematize data and information that are already available. This is important. When we talk about scientific synthesis, we try to integrate very heterogeneous data sets. But we do not work with the collection of primary data. The idea is to use what is already available. We know that we have a huge amount of available data for public access that can be better used to extract the relevant knowledge for society. So based on this model, we can conceptually develop new concepts. We can analyze data grids, we can model data and create scenarios and solutions. The bibliography shows that this type of research has a greater potential of innovation. So the Synthesis Center has the experience of creating important products that have sometimes changed areas of science, that had important application in the area of decision-making. The example is the concept of ecosystem services derived from the first models of centers of synthesis. I brought a quote that illustrates the process of scientific synthesis. I brought a quotation in English because it's very elegant. The extraction of otherwise unobtainable insights from a combination of disparate elements. So this is the integration that we are constantly mentioning. So this model of centers of synthesis, they are the infrastructure that allows and favors the development of this synthesis. The first was established in 1995 in the United States with funding from the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, University of Santa Barbara. And from this moment, other centers of synthesis were formed with different characteristics, focusing on specific areas of knowledge, but it's a pioneering model from this NCS. So here we have an example of these different centers of synthesis. We have been studying that. I visited some of these centers and talked to people who are managed these centers. And we try to absorb what are the most important characteristics of this synthesis processes. The synthesis can happen also out of centers of synthesis within universities, for example, in a very straightforward approach. So but this is the only, these are the research structures that give the best opportunities for this synthesis processes. So these groups, they usually they have 3 or 4 face-to-face meetings every year, and of course this is very much challenged by the pandemic, but this face-to-face meeting is a very important element for this personal interaction between the participants of the group. In an approximate period of 2 years, along this period, we need these meetings with an immersion time that is sufficient. Usually these meetings, they last for 1 week, and people are disconnected from their other activities, and they come to focus on how to integrate different perspectives and how to evolve in the production of knowledge. The centers also allow for this environment that is favorable to collaboration. So there are things that are thought about the environment, areas for interaction, couches, sofas. It's an environment where you leave your office or your classroom and you feel more comfortable to materialize this collaboration. They also offer differentiated support, that it can be support in IT, in scientific communication, and also the follow-up of the dynamics of the teams, facilitation of meetings. And another important characteristic is that these groups also count on international cooperation. This allows for the cooperation between different scientific structures, which is positive. The centers of synthesis, they have PhD programs associated, postdocs, scientists that may be resident for these groups or can interact in different ways. So we must think of what favors interdisciplinarity in the centers. We have a vast bibliography that I want to share with you, some references in the end. But in addition to this logistic and technical support to facilitate interaction and innovation, also this favorable environment allows for the development of trust within the groups. This is an important aspect that hard science sometimes and also biological sciences, they are a little bit distant from this social dynamics of the participants of a group. But this is an essential aspect so that there is this trust, this exchange, and the integration of different perspectives. This is a directed effort to make the best of the diversity of this group. So it's important to manage the group leadership. This group have leaders. In a group of 20 people, for example, you may have 2 leaders. But the team of the central synthesis must be alert so that this leadership does not become a dominance. So it's important that all of the members have the opportunity to conclude. So briefly, background of where the center of synthesis came from. We have a starting point that sets the conditions to develop scientific synthesis of knowledge, the maturity of the scientific community in the area of biodiversity and the environment. And I always bring my perspective of fomenting agent. This is continuous investment for more than 20 years with very well structured, long-lasting, that raise the level of our production. There's a lot of information available. In this scenario, you have also databases of public access. They are becoming a reality. So the data produced by the Brazilian community can be accessed by people anywhere else in the world that maybe they have more structural conditions to work on this knowledge synthesis. So we realized that this was the moment to start ourselves a Brazilian Center of Synthesis. The idea first came in the PELD monitoring and follow-up meeting when we brought this theme to our discussion to know how we could advance in this pathway. And this historically PELD was launched in 1997. And since the first moment when it was launched, from the first call for projects, we already planned for the creation of centers of synthesis. But we always debated, how are we going to do this? So we proposed an initial production of synthesis. The results were not good. So it raised an alert that we needed something else to have this synthesis, that our structure of science and technology and even the structure of the university did not allow this synthesis to advance with favorable grounds. So we had the perception that there was an opportunity for a Brazilian Center of Synthesis that was worth mentioning, that is the only one in the region. It's a very innovative structure. The first project in partnership of CNPq, the ministry, it's the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation, and FAPESP. So I want to briefly say that symbiosis is being implemented in 3 phases. 2018 was the planning phase with a number of workshops, technical visits. In 2019, there was this work to launch the first actions of symbiosis, which is a simplified structure. As of next year, of course, that we have a difficult perspective of funding, but we must prepare a proposal to consolidate the centers. So symbiosis work with this simplified proposal implemented as a CNPq research program, but as a differentiated program that have a whole structure where we're going to work. And along the year, we are going to work on this proposal to consolidate the center based on the experience that we are having of the first projects, to identify what's really necessary to consolidate this structure. So in 2019, one of the aspects that we started to consider was how to organize a governance structure to the center within a CNPq standard, which is the normative resolution 007 2019, and how to make it work in a differentiated way and going towards the structure for a center of synthesis. So we prepared this governance structure counting on 3 committees: a consultative advisory committee that is more encompassing, that plays this role of providing an interface with society to identify demands, opportunities. We have 4 different sectors represented here. And after, I'm going to tell you more about this advisory committee. We have a scientific committee that plays the classic role of scientific consulting, monitoring of projects. And in this scientific committee, we try to have a regional representation. This is another aspect that we must consider in Brazil on how to represent regional differences. This is a huge country with a very different culture and differences between the regions.
Tem comitê executivo, que é comitê pouco menor, que envolve
We have the executive committee that is a little bit smaller, involving people responsible for funding, with people responsible for partnership resources and the implementation of the actions. And this other structure, which is project management, that has the role of executive secretariat, planning and execution of actions. And I'm going to go into more detail about this project management, which is innovative in CNPq. We are doing this as well. So in 2019, this standard was published. In 2020, all of this structure was implemented. It's already active. This is a very different experience within CNPq. Usually, the call for projects happen and then we structure the program. Here, it's a different path. We are reflecting on structuring the program before executing. So we made the effort to implement the structure so then we can launch the first action. In 2019, we launched the first public call for projects for Symbiose. And I'd like to bring about this call some important points that I think that will favor interesting results on the aspect of interdisciplinarity. So the call for projects started in item 1.2. We developed a conceptualization of scientific synthesis. It was worked together with the scientific committee in a process of internal discussion, and then there's a moment that we have to make a definition within the agency what will be exactly the call for projects, but we highlighted some topics. Scientific synthesis correspond to an inter or transdisciplinary research approach. And we also describe what would be the work groups to develop the synthesis. So these work groups, there's literature showing that they are more effective when they include a diversity of thematic and theoretical perspectives, gender balance, diversity in age, range, career, regional, ethnical, cultural representativeness, and each one of these words has a weight and a thought process behind it. And the groups can count on the perspective of different social actors in different professional areas, such as environmental managers, representatives of traditional communities, and others. What I think is important that I want to bring to you is that we define this concept in the call for projects, that it could be like a guideline for the call for projects, but it also unfolds in the criteria of evaluation that were used for this call for projects. So the criteria that had more weight was the adherence to the concept of scientific synthesis as defined in item 1.2. This made a difference in the evaluation process. In addition to that, there was another criteria that tried to analyze more specifically the composition and qualification of the team to fulfill the proposed goal. To talk about transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity can sound very good, but if we don't think on how it's going to happen in practice, it's like a word without meaning, and it's very important to avoid that. So from my perspective, I think that the ideas must be conceptualized, but they must have a direct meaning. And here I want to talk about these truths of this tree of knowledge on how science developed. And I hope that you see, I know that you cannot read these boxes, but this is a representation of the organization chart from CNPq. You have the organization chart of the different institutions of research and knowledge. And CNPq is a very hierarchical organization. All these blocks are very close. And here are the boards, the combinations, different combinations. And after that, you have the support committees, subsidiary committees, and it has many branches, but the boxes have communications, but it's a structure that is made in silos.
So what I want to discuss and bring my standpoint, and maybe in the debate we can discuss that, how to operationalize the interdisciplinarity. For me, it translates into opening windows or creating, communicating vessels, allowing the flow of ideas and a joint work and co-production of knowledge. For this specific case of CNPq, I highlight some points that are hurdles that we have to overcome to stimulate interdisciplinarity in research. One of them is the model of financing on CNPq that is based on the taxpayer's number of the principal investigator. And it is hard to reach the group as a whole. We know that the model has limitations, and not always can we find another solution that is better. This is one of the policies that we have to discuss. Investment has a greater risk. Interdisciplinarity research has a greater risk because we are going through paths that are not built yet. We have to build these paths and pathways, and this poses more risk. And also, it needs more time for the return on investment, for developing trust, for adding other knowledges. So the products, so we have products. So the good interdisciplinarity requires more time. The understanding, as I said, the interdisciplinary process is an interaction between people or among people. And the principle of neutrality, I was even thinking that in public administration, there are these 5 base principles for public administration. One of them is impersonality. I'm about to finish. But we cannot mistake impersonality with non-discrimination or not relating to people. Ethics is the pathway to see the difference. Hermetism, the hermetic committees or evaluating committees, which we can also call the academia corporativism, is another hurdle to be overcome in the interdisciplinary research. In addition, we have other limitations in the system. The and the CNPq platform is probably launching a new system, but we have limitations, which is the shared share calls. I cannot have a share project in my area and a health area due to the limitations in the platform. And I brought a sentence that I believe illustrates better thinking out of the boxes, that poetry is flying out of the wings, by Manuel de Barros. So some examples within CNPq of this transversality that we are seeking. In project management, that is something new that we created in Symbiosis. It is the interest of multiplying this experience to other CNPq projects. We have representatives in environment, international cooperation, and communication. And you already see that we need to add people from health sciences and agricultural sciences. In the assessing committees, we have all these areas, and involving the ministries of science and technology, environment, agriculture and livestock, and security, which are dialogue to be built in these structures. And this is reflected. It's interesting to think when we seek for interdisciplinarity in infrastructure, this is reflected in action. So the work groups that responded to the first call of Symbiosis are interdisciplinary. We selected 7 projects that have 133 members of the team and 93 institutions involved. And all the groups have non-academic stakeholders in their composition. So we are very happy to see the result responding very well to the expectations. And so it is a pleasure to develop the activities in these groups. Within CNPq, there are other examples of programs that aim to have a better multidisciplinary. One of them is in INCT, and we have some members of INCT here in the panel that seek this multidisciplinarity. At that time, they call it multidisciplinary, that evolved for interdisciplinarity, and now we are aiming transdisciplinarity. And the Lattice, which is the repository for research groups in Brazil, we will carry out a census this year, if not possible this year, next year. But internal research proves that this can be the GBP can be a tool to improve this transdisciplinarity. So, some take-home message that is interdisciplinarity should permeate the biggest number of instances in the structure we want to create. Most of the work is breaking down the obstacles to the communication among people and disciplines. Optimization is continuous. We need to have cognitive flexibility. Difficulties exist and are huge, but there's space for new ideas and structures. And to give you an idea of the difficulty we are living in CNPq, we have a perspective of decrease of more than 60% of the employees in CNPq up to 2025. So we are passing through shrinking in our ranks. And another novelty that I can bring, that although all the difficulties, there is a willing within CNPq for these new formats of research financing that understand society better, especially because agencies are being pressured to show impact of the research. When we say impact of the research is impact in society, and we're trying to structure ourselves to develop that. Briefly, the role of scientific communication that I believe is key, and surely we'll discuss in your discussions of the Network for Citizen Science, is that scientific communication has a key role in the development of research. Symbiosis, this is a structuring axis we developed in this area, a strategic communication plan for 10 years. This year, we are implementing the first plan of action in communication and a component for dissemination through webinars to promote within scientific community these very important concepts behind the symbiose beliefs, that interdisciplinary, co-production, many things. What else? Other examples on how we are trying to advance in scientific communication within CNPq. I'm concluding, I swear. In PELD, which is the public, we launched the public communication for PELD, and which is the ecologic research, the long-term ecologic research. And the scientific community should be considered as an integral part for science fostering. We also we could change what was a standard, including different levels of grants, including masters and PhD students, and other different levels to simulate the knowledge production. Well, that's it. And my take-home message is opening windows to ventilate, to have new air. And here you have my contact and CNPq. I want to congratulate you because I've been following up your struggle and in this building of the synthesis. And in my opinion, is extremely important to advance in the construction of this new agenda for research. And so relevant, as Maria and Pedro already highlighted. I now would like to call Yuri. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Perfect. Good morning, everyone. I believe that you're already hungry and tired, and I'll try to be brief. But it was easy. Being the last one, I learned a lot. And although we didn't discuss before, my presentation connects with the previous talks. It's an honor to be here. I thank the invitation. This is a fantastic initiative. And what I would like to say is to touch two issues with some examples. First, if we have to think in interdisciplinary infrastructure, or shouldn't we work in insisting in interdisciplinary work that is connected with this idea of opening windows? So an infrastructure that inserted in the academic structure. So we have to insist to include the non-academic in the co-production processes, and also in management, in methodologic aspects. We should be interdisciplinary insistence, and this is what we need the most to comply with the most ambitions, with the ambitions of citizen science. So how to decolonialize the academic. And the second issue is, what is citizenship in citizen science? Who is the citizen in citizen science? And to define the citizen in citizen science, shouldn't we define science as well? So up to what stage are we able and are we willing to refuse the model that Maria Carmen mentioned of the USP professor? How can we relate research and knowledge transfer beyond the technology transfer or the service for rendering? Up to what stage can we open not only the windows but the doors of the academy, delegating power to projects that not only do they produce things to society but with society? We have some experiments on that. Almost every university in Brazil. But I would like to mention our transversal background for all the students in undergraduate students that focus in the transdisciplinary aspects for an intellectual, for a researcher of the future. We have many of them in traditional knowledge that work where professors of UFMG, where biologists, physicists, anthropologists, they host a colleague and they host a master of traditional knowledges like potters, like carpenters, like indigenous leaders that are received and treated as doctors. Some of them even receive titles of Doctor Honoris Causa. And the IAT discipline, which is our equivalent to IEA, we just conceived this title to indigenous leader that is a producer of knowledge. So this is an intent to try to recognize the citizens, the civil society as co-producer of knowledge, recognized and legitimized knowledge, authorized by the academia, and they take part as a real co-author. And Amarek is a son of that. We have a graduate studies course where with science generation to understand scientific dissemination as one of the parts in the ecosystem and a tool for something higher that is catalyzed in scientific citizenship. And later on, I will define what is citizenship in citizen science and what is scientific citizenship. I will share, and I'm sorry, and excuse myself because some, where is it? Is it working? Can you see my screen? Yes. I excuse myself because some of the slides, we are still in the last half year of 2020. So some of the slides are Spanish. I didn't translate from Spanish to Portuguese because they represent some of the reflections that comes from this policy paper. UNESCO, the University of the State of São Paulo is in this effort of building guidelines for public policies, Ibero-American public policies for different aspects in the relationship science society, mapping existing policies and experiences, including citizen science in Ibero-America, with the effort of building a policy brief to guide policymakers and decision makers. And my colleague in Argentina talked about public communication of science, where we do not focus on the aspect of communicators per se, but the communication of knowledge, where citizen science has a whole, a giant whole. And it will be published in the next few days. This is an anteprima that I will give you that helps us focus in this interdisciplinarity of infrastructure based on political guidelines, both internal to the academic world as state policies. I always like to open this discussion from that. The Article 27 of the Human Rights Declaration is the right to science. And right to science, as put in 48 by United Nations, it's not only the right to know, to right to information, but the right to be part on the cultural and scientific life. Use and be part of the benefits it generates. So the right to science in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is taking part in science, not just being informed and receiving knowledge. This is already is a calling for the key role in citizen science. And Previous to that, Albert Einstein, already a famous scientist back then, said that every thinking human being should have the opportunity of taking part of the major scientific problems of their time, even when their social position do not allow them to dedicate time to reflect about theoretical questions or to appropriate of knowledge. Only when science complies with this mission, fulfills this mission of allowing all the citizens to take part in scientific thinking, science will have the right to exist. So for Einstein, science has no right to exist if it is not citizen science. So in the last 20 years, we watched a reflection. Maria Carmen and Pedro show that, and also in the local level in CNPq, a reflection both in terms of policies on how to build guidelines to implement this promise. There are many policy briefs, especially in the European Union, on how to strengthen this interaction science-society, how to communicate science that is not only transmitting knowledge, transferring knowledge, and there are many studies on how to produce these dialogic mechanisms, and UNESCO mapped that and built policy briefs about scientific education and open science, which include many topics in citizen science, and mapped the policies in Ibero-America as a whole. There are many manuals and collections. There is a vast archive about citizen science, focusing on that, not only reporting success experiences, but think on that politically and therefore as an infrastructure.
And also in a broader field, this reflection comes a result of a debate on the role of expertise, the technocracy that was previously mentioned, and also the current catastrophe of the infodemia of misinformation, and from the point of view of policies and the role of scientists as a broker, as an intermediary, as an informer of social, economic, and health policies, and so on and so forth. So this is to say that there's a lot of discussion on that, and that we need to think on how to implement that. Almost everybody reached this conclusion, the need to go beyond the model of transmission deficit, that on how the public receives information and knowledge. And today I define this as a rainbow of science communication with countless experiences trying to modulate the degree of co-production, participation, leadership of the public in these experiences of dialogue between science and society, the classical dissemination, informing and popularizing science. It became a part of the ecosystem, but they have growing degrees of protagonism, both in citizen science, deliberative processes, co-production. So in this policy brief, we try to focus on perspectives that will help you to think on processes to implement that in universities and in public policies. The focus is that it's essential to focus on the diversity of functions that exist, the diversity of objectives and techniques in this process of social appropriation of knowledge. We must go beyond the objective and the mission of the mere scientific literacy. It's necessary to have scientific dissemination, the university trying to promote science with the single objective of giving visibility to this public literacy. Our focus is that scientific culture must be strengthened by university. And again, culture is not the same as scientific knowledge. If you want to strengthen scientific culture, you don't want simply to inform and to educate the population. A culture, is not the same as knowledge alone. Much to the contrary, is made of compasses and norths, values, common goals, symbols, and myths. Science itself has its own rituals and myths, so scientific culture has that as well, and it works based on relationships of power. So if we want to think of citizen science as one of the mechanisms to strengthen a scientific culture, you must think on it based on on the relationships of power that we reproduce or not. And citizenship that people interpret as right. You are a citizen, you have the right to know science. So citizen is not only a right, and I'm going to show you that citizenship has to do with specific kinds of power. So in the experience of citizen science and in the infrastructure that we will provide for it, up to what point are we really accepting to share this power to decide with the citizens? Up to what point are we sharing the responsibility? Up to what point are we sharing this belonging and a scientific identity? So this is the idea that policies need to be specific for these different goals in these processes of social appropriation, and they must be specific for different actors. To make citizen science, we need policies not only from university to university and to the university stakeholders, but we need policies for the citizen stakeholders, focusing on the cooperation, on diversity, on cooperation and co-production. In Colombia, we have a national policy for that. It's one of the few countries of Latin America that formulated and implemented a very explicit and detailed policy of social appropriation of science technology. Science plays an important role, and scientific promotion is seen as one of the parts of it. So it's not only the communication of science that is seen from the STS perspective, as mentioned by one of the speakers, but also as a political approach with different mechanisms that provide for the active inclusion of the citizens in the process of appropriation, inclusion. It's a very well thought approach. So in this policy brief, and I'm sorry for this very busy slides in Spanish, but this is to give you an idea that we try to really go deeper into the idea that we need to design and implement policies that are inclusive in the construction of teams of citizen science, and the social appropriation of science and technology include the members of local technology, the local knowledges in the spaces, in the projects of social appropriation of knowledge. So they are not only the object, for example, of a museum of indigenous culture. We can also have designers that come from indigenous communities, guides for this museum. So to promote a real transdisciplinary approach, it is essential for the teams to be transdisciplinary as well. In Mamirawa, for example, we had an exceptional case, a sensational case, an attempt to implement sustainable management of the pirarucu fishing with the local communities. And it took us a little long to work because we had biologists, and for biologists was difficult to understand what the local people were saying about the ecology and the biology of the pirarucu. The riparian people were saying that they could select only the adults and the older fishes because they would recognize from the sound of the fish swimming, even in the dark waters, by the sound of the pirarucu, when they breathe, when they would catch oxygen out of the water, they could identify one by one. So they selected what they were going to fish. And for the biologists, it seemed impossible. When anthropologists came, the process started to work better. So it's very difficult from my point of view to have an ambitious project of citizen science, be it in the area of biology or ecology, if you think that you don't need the sociologist, the anthropologist, or promoters, specialized promoters in the area, people from IT. So many of these projects will need the management of these power relations that include different academic knowledges, especially people that know to really include the local knowledge, the local wisdom. This is very difficult to do, and except if you have a policy of transdisciplinary insistence, to really insist on that, on how to open the window to bring fresh air. So therefore, the policies for citizen science, and usually we talk about policies of social appropriation, but this is true for citizen science as well. They need to decentralize and to see university as a co-actor instead of the central as the main actor. So citizen science that allows for communicators, popular communicators, educators, popular agents, community agents to play the central role. So it must be thought based on multiple institutions, instead of simply the university doing something in its core and providing it, giving it to the world, to the outside. So if we don't have this kind of process in our knowledge and practice communities, we won't have citizen knowledge. We must implement an infrastructure of collaborative discussion. In another experiment, and I don't want to go too abstract, I am part of a team. We have just published on science. It was a struggle to convince science that this was science, but we have just published a project of a global citizen assembly on genetic science. This is a very vanguard area of knowledge. So we can do this as a community, teams for different continents. We are representing Latin America, and this is not part of the general culture and not in the public agenda. In Brazil, we don't have this genetic science and genetic regulation. So this is in the direction of decentralizing transdisciplinarity, decolonizing transdisciplinary, how to deliberate together, not only how to produce knowledge together, but also how to choose methodologies and regulations together. For that, we need new indicators. And the indicators that we have that measure scientific literacy and the social appropriation of knowledge are really weak. They're very poorly constructed. So to evaluate the impact of experience of citizen culture, of citizen science, we must rethink what we want and what we understand and how to measure the impact. So, and I try to participate of this international groups to define good indicators of social appropriation of knowledge. They will help us in the projects of citizen science. And I'm concluding because I don't want to extend too much. But the first point is, if one of the territories, of the places where citizen sciences happen, this collaborative, inclusive practices, is the place to favor the dissemination of scientific culture, then we need to think politically about citizen culture, because culture is not only literacy. The culture of a people is made up of values, objectives, of different ways of thinking and seeing things, and this is what scientific culture gives you, another way of doing things, but it's also made up of power relations. So to make up a culture, you must think of power relations. Up to what point our USP colleague says the university has nothing to do with that. It criticizes the external power relations, but does not open its gates for everybody to do this together. So up to what point can we, let's say, break with this paradigm? And up to what point citizen science is scientific citizenship? You know that in this network, There are different perspectives and definitions of citizen science. Those that came from the initial practice, from biologists, those that came from the science technologies, from the STSs that were previously mentioned. And from my approach, and I come from the area of social studies of science, we used to think of scientist citizenship, according to Irving, up to what point technocracy can be remodulated to allow for a real participation of citizens. So the scientific citizen is not only the citizen that understands science, but also is entitled to vote on it. So up to what point citizen science must be in the same field, not only of co-producing knowledge, but also that it can allow for knowledge to be better appropriated, but up to what point this citizenship will allow for the construction of a scientific citizen. So we have three dimensions to it. To become a scientific citizen, as any other citizen, you must have your ID card. You are a citizen of a place if you have your ID card, your passport. To have a scientific citizen, you must allow people to belong to science, to belong to scientific democracy, not only because they are able to understand, but also because they have the possibility to participate in the relevant debates of our times, as Weinstein would say. So belonging is part of this citizenship. So this citizen must build this belonging, and not to be a citizen, you must have the same rights as the other citizens. In Latin America, all the citizens have access to the benefits of science and technology. They share the same responsibilities on energy decisions, on climate decisions. Maybe we are far from having scientific citizenship in this sense. In my opinion, science must think itself from the same place. It must be transdisciplinary because it must be politically active in order to enter into different boxes of the university, and also in these silos that separate the wise men from the ignorance, the people and the lower layers, and the decision makers in the higher layers. So the sharing of responsibility and this right to vote. And finally, the third dimension is power. You are a citizen if you can participate of the governance of science and technology, even in difficult themes, such as transgenic science or management of energy resources or climate change. That's how scientific dissemination has the opportunity to gain back its relevance. While we are limited to demystifying fake news and explaining how vaccines work, while we are only focusing on this pedagogical impulse to promote literacy, we won't solve the problem of not exactly of ignorance, but of trust that was intentionally destroyed by the fake news manufacturers. So while we don't open this new window, which is to share the power, not only share knowledge, but from my point of view, citizen science cannot fulfill the promise in terms of opening this space of power for the people. So back to the opening statement, this idea of transdisciplinary is what it, and how we try to implement it, welcoming as intellectual scientists and professor people that come from other areas of wisdom. We must think that we want to become not only a popularization of science, and when we form the task force to fight against fake news in the pandemic, our idea is not do it only for people, but with people. One example of this power delegation and sharing, we created leaflets on how to do the homemade masks after the WHO thought that it was worthwhile. But we did not do that, calling the scientists to do this with rigor and the promoters to do this from the beginning. we were called by a group of Haitian women refugees that live in Minas Gerais, and they told us we need to set up a project to sew domestic masks to live because we are starving to that and to protect ourselves. So the project was called Adapt a Mask. They would sew 2 masks, one for them and the other for sale. And companies, fashion companies donated fabrics, scientists donated their knowledge, and they told us how the leaflet should be because it was meant for this project. So science was encompassed, was engaged by a call from this public, and the retirees from rural areas, they call us, they said, well, you're telling us to stay home. Well, we live in the rural areas. We stay at home anyway. So we are forced to go to the cities and to line up in front of a bank to get our money, our retirement money. So tell me, what can I say? What can I do instead of getting the bus and going to the city? So this attempt implied being engaged by the other, being invited by the other. This is a physiological need that came from the bottom to the top. It was bottom up. It was the demands of these popular communicators from the favelas, from the communities, popular communities, and whether it involves molecular biology or other kinds of science, it's determined by them. This is how I understand scientific citizenship. We have many forms of resistance. 2 minutes. Perfect. I only need one. So today, we are witnessing different forms of resistance against technocracy. It's very difficult today that the population delegate completely the decision-making on science, environment, and even on advanced scientific technology teams to a panel of specialists chosen by politicians behind closed door. So these forms of resistance against technocracy assume dangerous forms, as we are living now with the pandemic, with the climate negationism. Because from my point of view, we cannot deal with this process of resistance. Opening the windows that are necessary in this participative sense. So this resistance assumes forms that are not constructive, that are not positive, sometimes are anti-democratic. More favorable form as of political resistance instead of establishing enemies is to see yourself as a part of it, to exist inside the problem. Many of the new feminisms do that. Many of the environmental movements do that, and we must do that as scientists, as victims of anti-democratic attacks. We must see ourselves as a part of the problem, to see ourselves inside of it and look for productions. This, instead of let's call a colleague because he's nice, he's a good communicator, he will help us. That's not transdisciplinary. You are being multidisciplinary, yes, but if you open yourself to the window of insistence, of existing inside the problem, being part of a problem, you're going to say that the actors of that wisdom are not only in the different departments of a university and adding up the competences and the expertise of each one of the department, but also as a amplified peers committee. As some say, these actors of society are also co-authors. Science historical article has the co-authors, indigenous people from the Shingo, because they were the ones that found out and that showed the other actors that the paradigm that great urban civilizations only existed in the Andes, the Incas, for example, and not in the Amazon because of the ecosystems and as nomad hunters and actors, it was a fact. They took the anthropologists by the hand to see large urban cities in the Amazon. So they are co-authors. Up to what point can we do that with citizen science? Thank you.
Yuri, I thank you very much. I also agree that the problem is in the lack of trust. So we have to recover the trust of society in science. We will have a brief break, 2 minutes, just really to drink some water because we are a little late, but I believe it was extremely important, this roundtable with many contributions. So I didn't want to stop our speakers.
Nós temos muitas perguntas, né? Que ótimo.
We have many questions, which is excellent. Many of them here in the chat, in the YouTube. So we will make a round of questions. Some of them were already answered during the lectures. So I will make a round of questions with our speakers and questions related to the network. We will answer at the end of the afternoon. More general questions that are regarding the network, we will answer later. So I'll start by Maria. There are 3 questions, if you can help us. There is a more specific question that is anonymous, and the person says that there is an effort to take scientists to communities, but there is the users, but there's also an effort in the other way around, bringing the users to the research centers. Another question comes from Paula Dumont. She asked about brokers, the name brokers in the process of knowledge production. Wouldn't this stakeholder be useful in the interface between stakeholders and social and between university and social demands? And the last one is a question, a provocation from an anonymous to Maria. How would the avant-garde science be where it lacks the immediate usability? And by avant-garde science, he explains, there are demands of the public for growing knowledge, but in many areas like particle physics, there is no evident usability, and sometimes it seems too distant to our reality. How can we improve this pathway that you presented? Thank you very much for the questions. I will try to be brief, so we can promote more debate here. The user thing is very complicated, and why is that? Because there must be a perception of gain for both sides. The center where I'm director is expensive. It's expensive, but someone is financing. So the first thing I have to say is that users must know where to go. For instance, Professor Yuri was talking about this community of Haitian women that hired UFMG. So the first thing is being opened so people know where to go. There are many parts of society demanding knowledge. In our center, one of the things to do that is that we have a process to finance these networks. So we have grants, small grants of $20,000 into for 2 years, so 40,000 in a whole. And the sectors of society compete for these grants. For us, this advantage is that one of the requirements in this solution is that those who compete for the grant, they must have already a relation with the stakeholders, with the users. So this trust, legitimacy is not built by the center itself, because this is a long-term process. It costs a lot, requires a lot of dedication and logistics. So by financing those who already have this closeness to society, we decrease and put down most of the most difficult barriers that are not tangible in this relationship. For instance, the picture of the third cities applied for one of these grants. This increased because we continue to finance, and this network is in a position of power and over the center. We need them more than they need us in the agendas we have, and the way to include user is by giving them reasons to relate to you, and not only extracting from the users what we need, compensating them. For instance, we are trying now to increase the participation of local communities, which is much more complicated because it's much heterogeneous and scattered. So how to bring these groups? They have to understand what they gain in their relationship and what they win with that. Although this is the ideal, it's hard to understand. And there's the diversity of groups. We talk about communities as if all the communities were equal, and they are not. They are extremely heterogeneous. And even within a community, there are heterogeneous wishes. I can talk more about that, but I don't want to go too long on that. But this is the objective of our center. The issue of the broker, I have to say, quite frankly, it is the fundamental issue of having this conciliation of knowledge. What is the problem with the brokers? They are not trained to be brokers. University don't have students to be brokers. We train students to write thesis, work in research, or teach, not to be brokers, not to carry out this intermediation. Another problem in the broker is that this is a growing area that is not valued. So salaries are low. I employ in my center 4 brokers that have a salary as a postdoc student because we have the resource, but it's rare to have these people in these positions. So what happens? There's not that much incentive. There is an activity that is not valued, is considered a lower activity in the hierarchy of the university. All my brokers have a master's degree, but there's also a growing in PhD degree. So there's objective of value this position as essential and not as someone that are not able to be a professor in a university, and then they become volunteer to do a job that nobody wants to do. The brokers must have, I can send you a special issue of current opinion of sustainability and environment that is all based in a project of the SYNC, that is a Center of Science Synthesis in the United States, to which I was part for many years. They talk about many issues, and one of them, brokers. Who should be brokers and why do we need them? And I always make a joke with my students that brokers are usually those who are too young and they do not know what is good for them, or too old and they cannot do anything else in university. But we have to break this or shift this paradigms and see this role as fundamental. Avant-garde science. First poking here is that calling pure science as avant-garde is not a qualification, or as a general qualification is already applied science is avant-garde because it's trying to formulate a situation. If I put back this question about pure science, for me, all form of knowledge, all form of acting is legitimate and has to be considered. Those who like pure science do pure science. They can both have a role, as Yuri is saying, of writing or producing science, or may not have immediate relevance to the problem, to the existing problems. I believe that the major problem that I mentioned oftentimes is the hierarchization of knowledge, that basic knowledge or pure science is better than applied, and so on and so forth. And I would say that it's not a matter of institution, but culture in science, culture of knowledge, and those who produce culture of science and knowledge. And who do them? Us. So if you want to break down with this hierarchy in the university, you have to start by yourself, reflecting on how you judge the other knowledge in a way or another. So I believe that for me, the path exists in every possible way of knowledge and the way they can contribute. But being open to hear the other in society is key to try to change this culture. Thank you, Maria. I have some questions to Professor Pedro. Felipe Martins Alessio wants to know if you can give us some example about the rigor and relevance at the Federal University of Bahia. And Larissa would like you to comment what are the challenges to adopt in this current pandemic context. I think we have some experiences of that. And we had one recently with a parliamentary front. A third question in this block is about governance. What would be the role of governance in these approaches you just presented in your talk? Hello, thank you, Felipe, Larissa, for the questions. An example about the dispute between rigor and relevance. We have in university different deans or vice chancellors under the pillars of the university. Dean for teaching, dean for research, dean for extension. Maybe we could see a dispute to see if the budget of these deans are used to foster interdisciplinarity. So part of the budget for research and extension could be used to restructure the organization of the society that assigns more resources for one activity than to the other. So maybe we have an empiric difference of the results of dispute between these two approaches in university. Blandi was dean for science extension. So first she was director and then dean. If I'm not wrong, it was at that time there was not budget. After a lot of battle, there was this budget to support projects in interaction with the society, but the dispute is immense and the difference is huge, more than fourfold. This seems that there is a very pragmatic reflection of the dispute between these two visions of the role of the university in the structure of power, influentiating where would the money go to, what type of organization will be fostered. And this could be one of the cases of explicit dispute of by the two perspectives. As I said, we only had a specific budget for the Dean of Extension because there was a political dispute about the role in the university and the relevance that the university may have. So the university has a more adequate social perception. Larissa asked about the challenges for the co-production approach in pandemics. Well, there is a challenge that I talked about with a friend of mine that lives in US, that she caught COVID. She started her career there working. Maybe it's the first initiative in Brazil of getting science closer to practice. And one of the things they were discussing is that in order for the knowledge production associated to COVID incorporate or the dimension of hearing those suffering with COVID, maybe COVID patients should be part in the definition of the agenda against COVID. So most of the agenda is associated to intend to fight the disease, but those who with the disease have serious problems of sequelae that the disease leaves, even for those who don't have a breathing problem. And all this problem is very dear to people, and they don't have knowledge to deal with the sequelae, and they are not inserted in the hierarchy of knowledge about COVID. They are not in the top of this hierarchy. Maybe if the COVID patients would be part of this research, this would have a more diversified profile in these issues related with the sequelae by the disease. I don't have information from me within the system related to COVID, but as far as what we see in the public communication about how the science systems are organizing to fight COVID is in a great deal related to the production of vaccines and then treating the effects after recovering the disease. And what is the role of governance for transdisciplinarity? If you remember in my presentation, I talked about this moment of the university stakeholder as a stakeholder and entrepreneur universities that has to do with one of the dimensions of governance that is related to where the government of the university comes, or the guideline for governing an university. In many universities in Europe, there are many critical articles about that. There is a major influence of the economic power in the decision-making for research within the university, because the association of society in this change of governance of the university is associated to the integration of the university for technology transfer, for companies and industries. So it's a type of interaction that is more associated to the part of the society that holds the power than the society that does not have power. This defines the governance pattern and defines the type of activity that is better seen in the university and with which partners should we establish this type of partnership. So maybe this is an example on how governance can direct the type of action of research that is carried out and the type of action and research with interaction with the society. I don't know if I was able to answer the three questions, but I think eventually we can, the panel can complement.
Thank you, Marisa. We have like a great challenge, as we heard already. It's exactly this issue of the not understanding the relationship between synthesis and science. This is reproduced in a cascade, and the fomenting agents reproduce that. Yesterday, we saw that as much as we talk about the relevance of transdisciplinary research, people understand this kind of research as the mere scientific promotion, not in the sense of a dialogue, but as an extension, in the sense of extending the knowledge. This is a challenge that we have in our environment. Karen, a postgraduate student, she asked you a question about the education for master's and doctor's degrees and how agencies see that, this transdisciplinary education. So she wanted you to talk more about this and also about your experience in symbiosis. How do you see these changes in the requirements of fomenting agents and the education of our scientific professionals? And so we need to see this change around all of this network, about the system of science technology in the country. How do you see that in the context of CNPq? Thank you for the question. It's good that I have the opportunity to address this question. We talked about university, we brought the opportunity of the foment agency, but we must think as an interdependent and interrelated system. The foment agents, they have a huge responsibility towards this hierarchy of knowledge, as Professor Maria Carmen described, of valuing scientific production, the classic scientific research above the extension of our studies. So it's a process that we are trying to hit these boxes and trying to reverberate so that we can see a change. It's important to say that the university must understand that the foment agencies must dialogue, and they should be allies and not separated. The other day, I was rereading the book of Laura Miga, where she says that it's possible to have a healthy relationship between researchers and funding payers, the funding agencies. So at this moment, the foment agents must advance both in valuing this diverse education, not only of purely research, and also the common extension of study, and valuing the researchers as well. In CNPq, the system of grants for productivity and research, it was a system that was created in the 1980s. We had to grow the national research. And we also, these professionals needed salaries, additional compensation for their work. But this system castrates as well. It poses difficulties for science to disseminate in other forms of production. It includes that the person publishes a lot, and it's a vicious cycle in the sense that caps, for example, when in the case of post-graduation, they are based on the indicators, and those who define these indexes, these indicators, are international publications. It's not the foment agency itself. So the reins of the process are not held by us. It's the academia through committees and the foment agents who have a large participation in setting the direction where we must advance in the production of knowledge. At this moment, I admit that it's a failure of our national system not to have opened the whole horizon and understanding that research is diverse and need to incorporate new actors, and that the points for academic articles is not exclusive is not exclusive criteria. Of course, that there is a difficulty to quantify and compare things that are not numerical. So in terms of the impact, how to compare different impacts that are not qualitative measures. So we must advance in this discussion. And I want to say that there is love in technocracy. We must find these people and these communication links to advance in this process. In my experience, we understand that as we donate money, as we give money, we are concerned in trying not to establish promiscuous relationships or favoring some parties. But we shouldn't be afraid of that. We must know what we are doing and understand what is our role in the national technology system. So the dialogue and approximation between the university, foment agencies, and the scientists is necessary and urgent. Then we must find our allies so that we can advance together in this point. Thank you, Marisa. And you are making the difference. I'm sure of that. Yuri, there are some questions that are really interesting for you, and I'm trying to merge them. Almi, for example, he's part of the urban Meliponary project. In spite of being long-term activity, I see that citizen science faces several barriers in the academia also. How to change this role from the supporting role to become one of the main players? When there are many barriers and mechanisms that are difficult in Brazil. So what do we need to do? How do we really, how can we bring citizens to play the main role, to protagonism of the process? To really have power in this scientific agenda. He is part of the Stingless Beehive projects in São Paulo. An anonymous asked you to identify the article published together with the Xingu indigenous communities. If you could leave the link for this article in the comments, he asks you to do it. And Tamara wants to know, what are the challenges? I like to ask a question. What are the challenges so that we put ourselves as part of the problems, promoting the solution, as solution promoters? I think that these questions, they complement themselves. And, well, they add to each other. And both Maria and Pedro have just also answered to part of it. So I'm just going to add to them. The article, I have already published the link. It's in the Science magazine. If it's not there, please ask for it, because then I publish again. So the answer to this last question is very long. How to do this thing that I'm called insistence, to act from within the problem and not to resist to an outer reality to which we are victims. But in all of these recent approaches, both in the area of environment and also in the STSs in science, technology, and society. And I like to analyze that from the point of view of the feminism epistemology. It gives us tips and practical examples on how it happened. For example, when I started to study that in Italy, we had, for example, in the feminism, we had a great debate of feminists, women, on how to resist to technologies of assisted fertility, for example. They had as that mechanisms or the baseline control of women from the patriarchy. And there was this resistance from the feminists at that moment, seeing the body of the woman as an instrument of the patriarchy. In a few months, the feminists started to appropriate from that, instead of seeing the body of the woman as the object of a victim of a system created by men, they started to use the digital video cameras and to make movies, to shoot documentaries with that documentaries from the point of view of women. And at the same time, we had in Brazil a video project with indigenous communities where indigenous communities would produce their own documentaries. Instead of an anthropologist telling us how the indigenous culture worked, they started telling their stories using non-indigenous communities. The invention of the radio made by indigenous communities in the West Amazon is an extraordinary result of citizen science bottom-up. Instead of being a victim of the arrival of the white man to appropriate the culture and doing so, the shamanic use of radio antennas, which is very powerful. It's in use for teenager dates, and to meet each other, they have to row for 8 days. So this is another use of the radio. It's not only for communication, but it's a power instrument for them. In the academia, it's the same thing. I was teaching classes on that the day before yesterday in the doctorate of sociology, and we have classical examples of that. And I saw the series with the trans-epistemological approach instead of this should be called trans-epistemological insistences. So we have a number of different cases, the post-Chernobyl radiology, how we can change protocols and scientific methods. In epistemic change, not only different policies. It's not that science learned how to communicate differently, but it had to identify what it was rigorous methods to test the new ADSs drugs. So one student said, I was a Valley engineer. We had a problem in one of the Valley train railroads because we had a curve. Valley seized the land in order to make the train go straight in the meetings with the local communities. And this is the epistemological hierarchy. In these meetings, a woman that was illiterate, living on the top of a mountain that would be destroyed, started telling the engineers, you're doing it all wrong. Didn't you see how this mountain is? If you cut here, it will all collapse. It will all go down. And as incredible as it may seem, all geologists and all valley specialists had not analyzed the soil, had not analyzed the type of soil. And when they had to listen to this woman because the project planned for this community participation. They went there, saw that the type of soil would then collapse the whole construction work, and there will be deaths. So it's very difficult for the academia to open themselves for this kind of listening. At least we must the maximum, the point that we agree to go is simply listening to the others and then choosing what we are going to do. So to open ourselves to listen to the others is very difficult. This honoris causa doctorate, they are symbolic examples of these different models, but the boxes, the hierarchy, the silos, scientific culture is a culture. We have rituals. We have power relations, we have prejudice, discrimination, myths, and founding narratives of what scientific method is. So this is transformed little by little, gradually, but there are ways to doing it not in a top-down approach through the calls for proposal or funding for extension science, but doing it bottom up to change our practices and produce together with people. So what we have learned, for example, in our task force is by listening to the competences, to the knowledge that these people brought. The favela communicators now, they go with loudspeakers and they play audios recorded by them on how to protect yourself from the COVID-19. In the favelas, people were using diesel oil. They brought these competences. They had excellent brokerage competences to work in the favelas, in the communities. We could be, and we were the supporting actors. There was an inversion on those who produced the knowledge, but they knew that people were using diesel oil. They should not be doing it, and that there was a different way to sanitize hands in the community. So they taught us what kind of knowledge should be mobilized. It was not only the biomedical knowledge, so to fight the pandemic there, it was much urgent to have other type of knowledge, of solidarity, for example, and anthropological knowledge, and then we modulated from that. So from my point of view, is in the action that you will find this gradual cultural transformation, not at the institutional level. That's why I'm passionate about citizen science, because that's the advantage of it. Let's do it. And in doing, then you incorporate the basic science, the theory. It's not only applied knowledge, it's a practice that feeds back to applied knowledge, and then base knowledge, of course, makes sense, basic science. And I don't know if I answered, but it's a long answer. Yes, let's do together. Let's build and learn together. There's a lot for us to learn. And it was a very enriching morning. I want to thank Maria, Carmen, Pedro, Marisa, and Yuri. I want to thank you very much because it was really fruitful. We will have to watch again to be able to absorb all of this information and these wonderful messages. In the afternoon, we'll resume at 1:40 p.m. We are going to have a lunch break now. And if you can be with us in the afternoon, we're going to have a panel to discuss good engagement practices. We're also going to have different colleagues with bringing different experiences that they are going to share. And you are all invited for the afternoon session. Thank you.
Muito obrigada pelo convite. Tchau, tchau.
Thank you for the invitation.
E resistência.